Elizabeth, and today I'm here for part 2 of Sagalong. And if you don't know what that is, I will leave links down below so you can read up and find out. But basically we're reading one saga a week for the month of February, and now we are in week 2, and the saga in question is the Saga of Gunnlaug Wormstongue, or Saga om Gunnlaug Wormstongue in Norwegian. And I'm going to stick to his Norwegian name because I really struggle with pronouncing the English version, mostly because this is a fairly well-known story to me, and constantly having to change the name of the main character in my own head just confuses me. But I think this is a very different saga from the one we read last week, because last week we read the saga of Eric the Red, and that's a fairly fragmented story. It's really just a mishmash of the stories of several different people. In this saga, however, we pretty much stick to Gunnlaug Wormstongue throughout the story, and even when the narrative focus strays from him to someone else, it's always someone who's close to him, and the events or conversations we hear about will somehow have an effect on Gunnlaug's story. So it's much more focused, it's also linear in time, so it's a lot easier to read this than the one we read last week. And this is probably a better place to start if you have never read the saga and you want to dip your toes into the genre. When I was reading this, I kind of thought to myself that this is the YA version of sagas, because it's as close as you get in sagas to be a plot-driven story. There are main conflict and tension building, and it's resolved in one final battle, and then you get the aftermaths. Its main characters are teenagers, and it even got a love triangle, if you can call it love in all of their cases. But I mean, that's a bit of a flimsy analysis, but at least it's a lot easier to follow this story than the story of Eric the Red. If you're watching this and you haven't actually read the saga, I'm gonna try to give a very brief and superficial outline of the story. So here we meet three main characters. One of them is Gunnlaug Wormstongue himself. Then you have a woman called Helga, or Helga the Fair, because apparently she's the most beautiful woman ever lived on Iceland. And then you also follow Ravn Onundsson, or Ravn the Skald, I think is called in the English translation. And these three are the main focus of the story. Of course, this being a saga, there are hundreds of other names mentioned, but it's easier to ignore them if you don't want to delve into their stories in this one, because it's much more clearly focused around these three. So in the beginning, Gunnlaug falls in love with Helga and she with him, but Gunnlaug also wants to go abroad, like Vikings of high standing often did. And but before he goes, he wants to be betrothed to Helga. So he asks her father for her hand in marriage, and her father says no. And so Gunnlaug won't take no for an answer. He comes back with his father, and they come to an arrangement that makes Helga promise to him, but on the condition that he returns to Iceland within 3 years. And if he doesn't, then she's free to marry whoever. So Gunnlaug goes abroad, he travels widely, he goes to Norway, he goes to England, he goes to Ireland, and then he goes to Sweden. And in Sweden he meets, among other, Ravn, another Icelandic young man. And they are both skalds, that means poets. And they both have poetry they want to read out to the Swedish king. And they get into an argument about who gets to go first. And the king eventually decides that Gunnlaug gets to go first. They both read their poems, but then they kind of insult each other's poetry. And when Ravn departs, they are enemies. And Ravn says to Gunnlaug that you diminished me in the eyes of the king, I'm gonna diminish you in the eyes of someone else. Something that Gunnlaug just shrugs off, because he thinks that there will be no one who could think higher of Ravn than of him. He's got confidence, I'll give him that. But then Ravn goes home to Iceland and Gunnlaug doesn't, and Ravn wants to marry Helga, and this is where I say that I don't think it's really a love triangle, because I don't think Ravn loves Helga. He just wants to marry her so that Gunnlaug cannot. And he goes to her father. Her father declines and says she has this. He has promised her to Gunnlaug, and Ravn says, "Well, the 3 years are out," and her father Thorstein basically gives Gunnlaug another year to come home, but if he's not come home by this time next year, the marriage will happen. And it just so happens that Gunnlaug just arrives too late, and Helga is married off to Ravn, which Gunnlaug does not like. Neither does Helga, but nobody's asking her. And Gunnlaug and Ravn becomes even worse enemies. They meet and fight once, but they are divided by their families, and then eventually they end up going to Norway to fight it out somewhere where their families can't separate them, and they kill each other. Both of them dies, and then Helga ends up marrying a third guy and lives out her life with him, but when she dies many years later, she still holds Gunnlaug's cape in her arms, so apparently she has loved him through all of these years. So this is not really my favorite saga, and there are several reasons for that, but I still have some things I want to draw attention to, and it turned out there were more things I wanted to talk about than I thought, and I've narrowed it down to a list of 6 points, so I'm afraid this video might get a bit longer than I normally make, but I'm guessing if you're here, you're interested in the sagas anyway, so you might be able to forgive me blabbering on a bit. We'll see. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the belief in fate that these people have. It's part of the Norse religion that your fate was drawn out for you when you were born. The Norns, which are some sort of the goddesses of fate, are weaving your life thread in a yarn the day you are born, and everything is decided for you. And because of this, you also believe that you can get to know what your fate will be. You won't really have any say in what's going to happen, but you could maybe be told how or when or something regarding the future. Because the future is set, it's possible to see the future. And in the saga of Eric the Red last week, we saw a prophetess being invited into a household with big ceremony and predicting the end of a bad year. But here in the saga of Gunnlaug Wormstongue, it's a dream that does this job. At the very beginning of the saga, Thorstein Egilson, which is Helga's father, has a dream where he dreams a swan is sitting on the roof of his house, and then 2 eagles come and they fight over this swan, and they are both bleeding and they fall dead to separate sides of the roof. And then a third bird comes along, which is a falcon, and then the swan will fly off with the falcon. And there's a man present when he's talking about this dream who interprets this dream for him, saying that his unborn child is going to be a beautiful woman, and that the 2 eagles represent men that are going to fight over her and kill each other, and then she's going to get married to a third man who comes from the direction that this falcon comes from. And Thorstein does not believe this. He calls this man a bad dream interpreter, and he kind of dismisses it, but at the same time he really believes it, because he tells his wife that if the child is a girl, she's going to set it out in the forest and let it die. Her wife disobeys him and instead sends the child to his sister, where it's raised among some of the servants. But when Helga is 6, her father sees her, he thinks she's very beautiful, and ends up taking her home to the farm with him. And then, as happens in sagas, if there is a prophecy at the beginning, you know that the stuff in the saga is going to play out as portrayed in the prophecy, and that's exactly what happens. And that's kind of why I say that even though this story has something resembling a plot, that prophecy flattens any excitement in that plot before the story has even started, just because you know how it's gonna end, you know how it's gonna play out, you've seen the symbol of the story, and then you see the actual story, and it's gonna be the same story, more or less. And you also see the role of dreams other places in this saga, because when both Ravn and Gunnlaug are dead, both of their fathers get the message of their death in a dream where their respective son tells of the battle they've had, or reads them a poem about the battle they've had, and that they are dead. And this belief in fate and this strong role of prophecy is something that permeates the sagas, and it's a literary trait that you will see in multiple sagas that gives these stories structure. The second thing I wanted to talk about are the female characters in this saga, because last week we met with some fierce women, among them Frøydis and Gudrid, and they had major part to play in the saga, or they stood out as these really fierce and independent women. But that's not the kind of women we see in Gunnlaug Wormstongue's saga. The only one that's really mentioned a lot is Helga, and she is fair. She's beautiful, the most beautiful woman in Iceland, before or since. That's what we've told about her. And that's basically all she is. She is the classic trophy that two men are fighting over. She has no agency in her own right. She is married off by her father to a man she clearly does not want to marry. It's stated that she's not happy with the match. But this is not a typical female role in the saga, so this is actually a saga that sticks out by giving a woman this role as a trophy rather than being a person in her own right. And this role of Helga in this story is much more alike the roles that women play in like chivalric medieval literature than in the sagas in general. So that's one of the reasons why this is not my favorite sagas, because one of the things I've always enjoyed about the sagas are reading about these strong, inspirational women. And Helga is just not one of them. She's not allowed to be one of them. There are a few lines in this saga that tells us something about her and about showing that she also has a will of her own. One of them is that after she's married to Ravn and gets to know that Gunnlaug has come back to Iceland just too late, she meets Gunnlaug, they have a conversation, and after that it's said that Gunnlaug has to move her home to her father's house because he can't restrain her in his house where they are living together. So apparently she's trying to run away. And the other thing it says is that after she has talked to Gunnlaug, Ravn has no more joy from their marriage. I kind of interpret that as she refusing to share his bed. And that's a bad thing in a marriage in this kind of family-tied society, because that won't produce any heirs. However, one thing I found interesting is that this story, as well as the last one we read, starts and ends with a woman and the same woman. So here it is naturally Helga, but we start off by learning about her ancestry, and it ends up hearing about her life and her descendants and her death. So she is the one starting and ending this story as well, despite the fact that she's nothing more than a glorified trophy. Related to Helga, another thing I find interesting to read about in this saga is marriage, because this saga tells us several things about how marriage was handled in this society. We get to see how you would ask for a woman's hand in marriage. We see that Gunnlaug does it on his own first, and he is rejected. But once he brings his father and his entire clan or family along, they eventually get to an agreement. And through this we see that marriage is an affair of the bigger family. It's not between two people. despite Helga and Gunnlaug obviously being in love, that's not an argument at all. It's all about how this will gain and influence their families. And both the first betrothal of Gunnlaug and Helga, and then the ending of that same arrangement, is both organized by their respective fathers without involving them at all. The other thing we see here is that there are actually two different ways of being betrothed. One of them is in the original Old Norse called heitikona, and the other is called festarkona. And festarkona is as close to being married as you can get. That's got lots of rituals connected to it, and if you are somebody's festarkona, which is the female in this relationship, the female fiancé, if you are festarkona, you have a bond that's almost as strong as marriage. If Helga had been festarkona of Gunnlaug, the arrangement, the promise, could not have been broken with any honor left. But she is in fact his heitikona, and that's a weaker arrangement, and that was often given a time limit, as is the case here. So for 3 years she is promised to him, and if at the end of that time some of the arrangements are broken, the deal is off, basically. So she can be married off to someone else without there being any dishonor in this breaking of vows. The fourth thing I wanted to talk about is the position of skald in this society. A skald, as I said earlier, is a poet, and they obviously had a very high status in this society. Both Gunnlaug and Ravn are skalds, and they leave Iceland and they go to other places, but they are always invited in to the most prominent and powerful men. Gunnlaug first goes to Norway, where he meets an earl, then he goes to England where he meets a king, he goes to Dublin, Ireland, and meets a king there as well. He goes to the Orkneys where he meets another earl, and he goes to Sweden meeting a third king. And everywhere he went, he performs tributary poetry to the people of power he meets, and they reward him richly. They give him fancy clothing and expensive jewelry and a sword, and he is really handsomely rewarded for these poems. And when Gunnlaug and Ravn first have their falling out, it happens in Sweden in front of the Swedish king, where the thing that pushes Ravn over the edge from being friends to being enemies is the fact that Gunnlaug offends his poetry in front of the king, because Gunnlaug reads a kind of poem called a dråpa, whereas Ravn's poem is a flock. And these are two different kind of poems. It's different technical rules for both of them, but a dråpa is counted as a more complex form of poetry. It has refrains, and it's got a very strict pattern, and it's considered more difficult. So when performing a poem to a king, it should be a dråpa, because that's the highest level of poetry, whereas when you perform a poem for an earl, it could be a flock. But Ravn performed a flock for the Swedish king, which Gunnlaug pointed out in front of the king, and that hurt the honor of Ravn and diminished him in the eyes of the king, and because of that they were now enemies. Because this is an honor society where your reputation and your honor is very important, and offending that could start big family feuds or smaller personal feuds, which is the case in this. But regardless of feuding or not, the poetry, or the skald diktning, the Norwegian word for it, is very important, and it's used as a tool throughout the story Gunnlaug uses it both to gain access to these powerful men and to flatter them and get riches, but he also uses it to mediate between groups. He does that when he visits an earl in Sweden, where there are two groups, one with Norwegians and one with Swedes, and both of them arguing about which earl is most powerful. And then Gunnlaug creates a poem sort of giving credit to both of them, and that saves the day. And very early on in the saga, he also uses a poem to get himself out of a scrape he's gotten into. And this shows that in a society where honor and your reputation meant everything, this poetry was very important for your reputation. You needed skalds to build you up with these flattering poems, but also a wrong kind of poem, a need dict, which is a poem written to offend you, would hurt your reputation and could be as permanently damaging as anything else. In addition to being good with words, Gunnlaug is also good with the sword, and he's constantly described as this macho man winning battles and doing all these other things as well. But you can be both. You can be both muscle and brain in this world. And Gunnlaug is sort of the poster boy for this mix. The penultimate thing I want to say about this saga has to do with history and reading this as history. I talked a lot about that last week. I'm not going to go into all that in detail again, but this saga claims to be written by a man called Are, but the experts say that that's probably not true. He died around 1190 something, if I remember correctly, but this is assumed to be written down for the first time a bit later than that, so that's probably a lie. Don't know for sure. But there are some things in this saga which can really timestamp the events. And one of the things is that in the saga it is said that this year the most glorious thing happened. Christianity came to Iceland and everybody changed their old gods to the new. I don't think the process was as simple as that. That's a gross simplification, but we know that the Christianity was accepted as law at Altinge in the year 1000. So that tells us exactly when this happened. And then at a later part in the story between Gunnlaug and Ravn, they are at the thing. They have Ravn has married Helga, and Gunnlaug challenges him to go home, or holmgang in Norwegian, and that's basically a duel. And they fight this duel, but they don't finish it. They get separated by their families, so they don't get to fight to death as they themselves actually want to. But it is said that 2 days after their failed duel, the thing passed a law making going home or making these duels prohibited on Iceland. And that's why eventually Ravn and Gunnlaug goes to Norway to settle their score, because this is still legal in Norway at the time. But that happened, that law was passed on the thing in 1006. So that gives us the basic timeline for this story. But it also tells us that the one who has written down this story has mixed up several stories, because it's also talked about how Gunnlaug was in England when King Canute of Denmark was raiding in England, and that happened in 1014 at a time where Gunnlaug should be dead, according to the timeline. So clearly you can't read this as history either, because the timelines of things told don't add up. The last thing I wanted to mention, because yes, this video actually will have an end at some point, is something that Elena Makridina talked about in her video last week about the Saga of Eric the Red, where she asked or mused about whether all of the sagas are interconnected into this bigger, greater universe, like you can see in some book series and stuff. And The short answer to that is yes, because the sagas are chronicles of real people, and especially the Icelandic sagas deals with a fairly brief period of time in Icelandic history, and it deals with real people, and there weren't that many people on Iceland, so they tend to show up in each other's sagas, and the stories interconnect in various ways. And the saga of Gunnlaug Wormstongue is a perfect example of this, because this interconnects with a lot of other sagas. I haven't read enough to know all of the connections, but I know some of them. For instance, Helga is the daughter of Thorstein Egilsson, and Thorstein is the son of Egil Skallagrimsson, and he is the main character of Egil's saga. And that's one of the longer sagas, like 150 pages, where this is 30. And that's one of the more well-known sagas, and it contains one of the most beautiful poems, if not the most beautiful poem of all of this Icelandic literature, where he composed a poem about the death of his son, and it's heartbreaking, and I thoroughly recommend reading that. It's beautiful. There's also direct references in this to other sagas. For instance, it's mentioned one of the times they are at the thing that this is the third best visited thing in the history, and then it's said that the two with more visitors were the things after Njol's burning and after another event that I can't remember the name of right now. But anyway, both of those events have their own saga. The Njol burning is, of course, the key element of Njol's saga, which is another one of those big famous stories, one of the long narratives from this period. And it's also rather heartbreaking, but in a different way. But there are also lots of other people here referenced that show up in other people's sagas. It's mentioned Olaf Peacock, I think he's called in English. He has a saga of his own, the skald that takes Gunnlaug by boat from Norway to Iceland when he's trying to get home in time to stop the wedding. He is part of Olav Tryggvason's saga, which is one of the king's sagas in Snorre, and the list goes on. This really connects with a lot of other sagas, and it could be interesting to look at all of those connections, but I haven't read enough of the other Icelandic sagas to be able to tell those stories, but I know the links are there. Some of them because I've cheated and read the footnotes where all of these links are mentioned, and some of the links is to stories I have read, like Egil's saga and Njol's saga. But basically, this is definitely interconnected with a bunch of other stuff, and if you read all of them, it's fun to get lots of puzzle pieces to paint together a big picture of this time in Icelandic history. So I'm guessing that this is probably my longest video on my channel to date. I hope you don't mind. I hope you found something interesting in this. Next week we're going to leave the Icelandic sagas and instead go into King's Saga, which is another groupings of saga, and read the saga of King Harald. He was a Norwegian king, and I haven't read that story in many years, so I look forward to revisiting that. I can't even say I remember much of what that particular story is about, so that's going to be fun. And if you're still with me at this point, bye bye, I will see you next time.